Kunja Vihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Vihari Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Hare Hare. Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Jaya Prabhupada, 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 Jaya Prabhupada. Jaya Prabhupada, 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 Jaya Prabhupada. Srila Prabhupada ki jai, Grantara Sri Caitanya Caritamrita ki jai, Shri Shri Gaura ki jai, Jai Shri Shri Radha Govardhana ki jai, Jai Shri Shri Krishna Balaram Giri Govardhan ki jai, Vrinda Devi Tulsi Devi Mahani ki jai. All glories to the simple devotees, all glories to the simple devotees, all glories to the simple devotees, all glories to Shri Shri Guru and Gauranga Gaurkamandi Hari Hari Bol. We are going to be reading from the Sri Caitanya Charitamrita, Adi Lila chapter 7 verse 102. Jai Jai Shri Caitanya Jai Nityananda, Jai Jai Shri Caitanya Jai Dvaita Chandra Jaya Gaura Bhakta Vindam, Jai Jai Shri Caitanya Jai Nityananda, Jai Dvaita Chandra Jai Dvaita Chandra Jaya Gaura Bhakta Vindam, Jai Jai Shri Caitanya Jai Nityananda, Jai Dvaita Chandra Jaya Gaura Bhakta Vindam. Verse 102. Eta Shunyasi Prabhu Balila Bachana Dukkana Manaha Jadi Karinivedana. Word for word. Eta, thus, Shuni, hearing, Asi, smiling, Prabhu, Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, Balila said, Vachana, his words, Dukkha, unhappy, Na, do not, Manaha, take it, Yadi, if, Kari, I say, Nevedana, something unto you. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace Shri Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. Translation. This is Chaitanya Mahaprabhu speaking to the Mayavadi sannyasis of Benares. After hearing the Mayavadi sannyasis speak in that way, Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu smiled slightly and said, "My dear sirs, if you don't mind, I can say something to you regarding Vedanta philosophy." Repeatedly, after hearing the Mayavadi sannyasis speak in that way, Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu smiled slightly and said, "My dear sirs, if you don't mind, I can say something to you regarding Vedanta philosophy." Purport. Now, I just warn everybody, it's a very, very long purport. And Srila Prabhupada at the end of this purport quotes a Bhagavatam verse and the whole purport for that verse as well. So sometimes Srila Prabhupada refers to verses, he says you may look up such a verse to get more information. But in this case he's quoted the whole verse and purport. So okay, I may quiz, so make sure you stay awake. So everything in the purport that jumps into your mind, try and hang on to it. You can ask a question, we can discuss it. Purport. The Mayavadi sannyasis, appreciating Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, inquired from him why he did not discuss Vedanta philosophy. Actually, however, the entire system of Vaishnava activities is based on Vedanta philosophy. Vaishnavas do not neglect Vedanta, but they do not care to understand Vedanta on the basis of the Sariraka Bhashya commentary. Therefore, to clarify the situation, Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, with the permission of the Mayavadi sannyasis, wanted to speak regarding Vedanta philosophy. The Vaishnavas are by far the greatest philosophers in the world, and the greatest among them was Srila Jiva Goswami Prabhu, whose philosophy was again presented less than 400 years later by Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur Maharaj. Therefore, one must know very well that Vaishnava philosophers are not sentimentalists or cheap devotees like the Sahajas. All the Vaishnava acharyas were vastly learned scholars who understood Vedanta philosophy fully. For unless one knows Vedanta philosophy, he cannot be an acharya. To be accepted as an acharya among Indian transcendentalists who follow the Vedic principles, one must become a vastly learned scholar in Vedanta philosophy, either by studying it or hearing it. Bhakti develops in pursuance of Vedanta philosophy. I'll repeat that line. Bhakti develops in pursuance of Vedanta philosophy. This is stated in Srimad Bhagavatam 1-12. Tats chatanana munayo jnana vairagya yuktaya pasantya mi chatmatnam bhaktya shurta grihitaya. The words bhaktya shurta grihitaya in this verse are very important, for they indicate that bhakti must be based upon the philosophy of the Upanishads and Vedanta Sutra. Srila Rupa Goswami said, Shruti Smriti Puranadi Pancharata Vidimbina Ekantiki Hare Bhakti Upatayaiva Kalpate. Quote, devotional service performed without reference to the Vedas, Puranas, Pancharatras, etc. must be considered sentimentalism, and it causes nothing but disturbance to society. End of quote. There are many different grades of Vaishnavas, Kanishta Adhikaris, Madhyama Adhikaris, Uttama Adhikaris. But to be a Madhyama Adhikari preacher, one must be a learned scholar in Vedanta Sutra and other Vedic literature, because when Bhakti Yoga develops on the basis of Vedanta philosophy, it is factual and steady. It's another important point. I'll read that again. When Bhakti Yoga develops on the basis of Vedanta philosophy, It is factual and steady. In this connection, we may quote the translation and purport of the verse mentioned above. So that's the verse we just read from the Bhagavatam. So that's the end of that purport. Now Prabhupada will give the translation and purport to that verse as well from the Bhagavatam. Translation, this is from 1st Canto, 2nd chapter, verse 12. The absolute truth is realized by the seriously inquisitive student or sage who is well equipped with knowledge and who has become detached by rendering devotional service and hearing Vedanta Shruti. Purport. The absolute truth is realized in full by the process of devotional service to the Lord, Vasudeva, or the personality of Godhead, who is the full-fledged absolute truth. Brahman is the transcendental bodily effulgence, and Paramatma is his partial representation. As such, Brahman or Paramatma realization of the absolute truth is but a partial realization. There are 4 different types of living beings: the karmis, jnanis, yogis, and the devotees. The karmis are materialists, whereas the other 3 are transcendentalists. The first class transcendentalists are the devotees who have realized the Supreme Person. The second class transcendentalists are those who have partially realized the plenary portion of the Absolute Person. And the third class transcendentalists are those who have barely realized the spiritual focus of the Absolute Person. As stated in the Bhagavad Gita and other Vedic literatures, the Supreme Person is realized by devotional service, which is backed by full knowledge and detachment from the material association. We have already discussed the point that devotional service is followed by knowledge and detachment from material association. As Brahman and Paramatma realization are perfect realizations of the Absolute Truth, so the means of realizing Brahman and Paramatma, i.e. the path of Jnana and Yoga, are also imperfect means of realizing the Absolute Truth. Devotional service, which is based on the 4 grounds of full knowledge, combined with detachment from material association, fixed up on the oral reception of the Vedanta Shruti, is the only perfect method of realizing the Absolute Truth by the inquisitive student. Devotional service is not therefore meant for the less intelligent class of transcendentalists. Still there? There are 3 classes of devotees, namely first, second and third class. The third class devotee, or the neophytes, who have no knowledge nor are detached from the material association, but who are simply attracted by the preliminary process of worshipping the deity in the temple, are called material devotees. Material devotees are more attached to material benefit than transcendental profit. Therefore, one has to make definite progress from the position of material devotional service to the second class devotional position. In the second class position, the devotee can see 4 principles in the devotional line, namely the personality of Godhead, his devotees, the ignorant and the envious. One has to raise himself at least to the stage of second class devotee, thus become eligible to know the Absolute Truth. 2 more paragraphs. A third class devotee therefore has to receive the instructions of devotional service from the authoritative sources of Bhagavatam. The number one Bhagavatam is established personality of devotee. Number 1 Bhagavatam is the established personality of devotee, and the other Bhagavatam is the message of Godhead. The third class devotee has therefore to go to the personality of devotee in order to learn the instructions of devotional service. Such personality of devotee is not a professional man who earns his livelihood by the business of Bhagavatam. Such a devotee must be a representative of Sukadeva Goswami, like Sutta Goswami, and must preach the cult of devotional service for the all-round benefit of all people. A neophyte devotee has very little taste for hearing from the authorities. Such a neophyte devotee makes a show of hearing from the professional man to satisfy his senses. This sort of hearing and chanting has spoiled the whole thing, so one should be very careful about the faulty process. The holy messages of Godhead, as included in the Bhagavad Gita or in the Srimad Bhagavatam, are undoubtedly transcendental subjects, But even though they are so, such transcendental matters are not to be received from the professional man who spoils them, like the serpent spoils the milk, simply by touch of his tongue, by the touch of his tongue. A sincere devotee must therefore be prepared to hear the Vedic literatures like the Upanishads, the Vedanta and other literatures left by the previous authorities or Goswamis for the benefit of his progress. Without hearing such literatures, one cannot make actual progress. And without hearing and following the instructions, the show of devotional service becomes worthless and therefore a sort of disturbance in the path of devotional service. Unless, therefore, devotional service is established on the principles of Shruti, Smriti, Purana and Pancharatra authorities, to make show of devotional service should at once be rejected. An unauthorized devotee should never be recognized as a pure devotee. By assimilation, such messages from the Vedic literatures, one can see the all-pervading, localized aspect of the personality of Godhead within his own self constantly. This is called samadhi. Everyone still awake? Wonderful philosophy. Srila Prabhupada do the translation again. After hearing the Mayavad sannyasis speak in that way, Lord Caitanya Mahaprabhu smiled slightly and said, "My dear sirs, if you don't mind, I can say something to you regarding Vedanta philosophy." Amaganati Mirandasya Ganam Ganam Salakaya Sakshus Unmilitam Yena Tasmaya Shri Guruve Namaha Sri Caitanya Manobhishnam Stapitam Jena Bhutale Swayanupam Kadamayam Darati Svaparantikam Panchakalpaturubhishna Kripa Sindhu Bebecha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavibhyo Namo Namaha Jai Shri Krishna Caitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhara Sri Basari Gaura Bhaktivinoda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. So Sri Caitanya Mahaprabhu it's very interesting to study his behavior in his dealings with so much respect and etiquette. In other words, even though he's going to be speaking the highest truth to bewildered Mayavadis who've misunderstood Vedanta, he's seeking their permission and proper. Like in other words, you don't rock up to someone else's mutt and start telling them how it is, you know. And his whole behaviour from first arrival, great humility he showed. Then he overwhelmed them with his great effulgence. It's described as 10 million times more effulgent than the sun, which is difficult to imagine. Very effulgent. And then he spoke. Then they queried him about why he was carrying on like a fanatic, just chanting and dancing. And before up to this time, the devotees were being criticised a lot, especially in Benares, and depressed devotees like Tapana Mishra and Chandrasekhar. And this is one of the main reasons Caitanya Mahaprabhu is doing this to please his devotees and also to deliver the Mayavad sannyasis. So he spoke. He's just finished glorifying the glories of the holy name based on scripture and instruction from his spiritual master. And now they're inviting him to speak on Vedanta. And through this is a summarised portion of this pastime, and Caitanya Mahaprabhu will actually speak the whole Vedanta Sutra and explain it directly as it means, not in a twisted fashion. Because Vedanta sometimes, because we hear the word Vedanta used a lot in association with the Mayavadis. It's actually, but Vaishnava, as Prabhupada mentioned, he are the greatest Vedantist. Vedanta first for our guests or for the guests or new devotees. Vedanta means, Vedas means knowledge and Anta means the end. It's the total conclusion, absolute end of knowledge. There's no truth beyond this point. That's Vedanta. So, and the Vedas are very, very broad. And so to understand, for starters to understand, have access, Prabhupada says, to have access to knowledge, you have to have knowledge. To know knowledge, you have to have knowledge. It's a great mystery. And the Vedas are they describe, Gopi Prabhu describes as 100,000 lakhs of verses, which is 10 billion verses. So for starters, to be able to have access, and what to speak of reading them, assimilating them, understanding them, and coming to the conclusion, it's not possible for a mortal being. It's just not possible to compose them. So Srila Vyasadeva is the empowered Sakyaveshavata, or in some cases Krishna himself He's the literary incarnation of God, and he compiled all of the Vedas. Now the Vedas are there. They already existed. He didn't actually write them. He compiled them, and they were available through sound. So it's not like he was able to Google or get some books and get it all. He was able to access all that sound vibration, compile them, and it's explained in the 12th canto, I think it is. That's like when you have a basket full of jewels, and you have diamonds and rubies and pearls, and then you separate them all and you categorize them into different categories. So Srila Vyasa did that with the Vedas. He categorized it into the 4 Vedas. Then he wrote the Upanishads and what else did he write? Many other things, the Mahabharata and so many other things. At the end of it, he did something very, very amazing. He wrote Vedanta Sutra. This is what's been discussed here. The Vedanta Sutra is a total summary, and Prabhupada explains in later verses what a sutra is, or it's an aphorism. It's very, very short, very, very precise, very, very eloquent, applicable at all times universally, and written in a perfect linguistic manner. So it's perfectly refined, and it's very, very short. They're like, it's almost a code form. They're like 1 word, 2 words, 3 words, like that. So Srila Vyasa was not only able to compile all these Vedas, but then he's able to summarize them in this Vedanta Sutra, which is, and if you remember the Vedas are 94% Karmakanda. Only 6% is transcendence, but 6% is still 600 million verses. So it's a lot to take in. So we have to. The reason I'm saying all this, we've got to realise what's been given to us by Srila Prabhupada. To first have access to all this knowledge, and to have access to the essence of it, and to have access in a way that we can actually understand is extraordinary. So that's the Vedanta Sutra. So the Mayavadis were able to take this Vedanta Sutra and take the direct meanings and twist them and concoct a monistic, impersonal, demoniac philosophy, which is offensive. It's the opposite meanings. And so now Caitanya Mahaprabhu has been invited to speak Vedanta, and we're going to find Vedanta and Bhakti is synonymous. Sometimes they're not two separate things. I think Vasu Srestha Prabhu quoted that verse in the Gita yesterday. Vedase Savahivam Vedyo Vedan Krid. Where's it go? 15th chapter. Krishna says, I'm the compiler of the Vedas. That's Vyasadeva. I'm the knower. Vedanta Krid, I'm the knower. Vedase Vedchaham, I think it is the last bit. And I'm also the knower of the Vedas. So the essence of Vedanta is to understand Krishna. And Krishna says, Bhakti Mama Bijananti in the Bhagavad Gita, you can't understand me unless you do Bhakti. So the two go in hand. If you want to understand the essence of Vedanta, the end of knowledge, you have to do Bhakti. So Bhakti and Vedanta go hand in hand. You can't separate them. And Prabhupada mentions in the purport other processes of transcendental process like Gyan and Yoga, they're partial and imperfect because of the Bhakti element is missing. The Bhakti is what makes Vedanta perfect. In I think it was 1947, the God brothers of Srila Prabhupada, the senior sannyasi God brothers of Srila Prabhupada, this is sometime after Srila Bhaktisiddhanta had left, were very impressed with Srila Prabhupada's knowledge of his scholarly knowledge of Vedanta philosophy, of the Bhakti scriptures especially. And they wanted to acknowledge him, and also his devotion. They wanted to give him some honorary title, some title. So there was a discussion between two of the main, I can't remember their two names now, but anyway, one of them said we should give him the name of Bhaktisiddhanta, like that, and that was also the name of his spiritual master. And one of the other Maharajas said, it's not proper that we do this because our guru is called Bhaktisiddhanta. So he said, maybe we'll give him the title Bhakti Vedanta. So Prabhupada he didn't name himself Bhaktisiddhanta, he was given that title Bhakti Vedanta, so, which is, he understands the pure essence of Vedanta and performs pure devotional service, Bhakti. So it's an appropriate title. So Prabhupada mentions in that all the acharyas, that's a very important qualification. They're very, very learned in Vedanta. And Guru means heavy also, heavy with knowledge. And Srila Prabhupada was certainly heavy with knowledge. We're very fortunate. There's a book that talks about Srila Prabhupada before he came to India, and also I've heard Giriraj Maharaj say this, and I've read a passage where Tamal Krishna Maharaj repeats his statement, so that's what I base it on. That Srila Prabhupada, when he was a householder, he used to study Bhagavatam 4 hours a day. 4 hours a day. So it's not that he's just turned up in America in 1965 and winged it. It's a lifetime of preparation, and that's why his godbrother were impressed with his deep learning, very realised. And the most extraordinary thing about Srila Prabhupada's contribution, you could say, amongst many, is this is again described by his disciples in 1976. I've mentioned this before. Srila Prabhupada was becoming unwell, and also his senior disciples said, Prabhupada, you should have a break, slow down, you know. And they said, you should go and have a retreat. He said, and then said, Prabhupada, listen to what retreat. What is a retreat? He said, you go somewhere and you just stop everything, you chill out, you know, so to speak. And you just don't let anybody bother you. We can find a place somewhere and you can go there. And Srila Prabhupada agreed, okay, I will do this retreat. And they said, well, they chose Hawaii, to take him to Hawaii. And they had a house there and he would have some peace and quiet. And then Prabhupada says to his servants, pack all my translating paraphernalia, my recording, my dictaphone, my books. He used to carry many books from the previous acharya. Pack them all in, and the devotees realised he's not going to have a break. He's going to go on a translation marathon, which he actually did. And his servant that was there was noting at night time. I think sometimes he would, quite late at night, he would turn the light out so his servant would go to sleep, and then the servant would notice the light would go back on. So Prabhupada, he said some nights the light was on all night, and he could hear the click. Prabhupada would have a microphone, he would speak and turn it off in between his pauses, not to use, so he wouldn't use too much tape, so it was more condensed. So he'd hear the click, Prabhupada would speak, click. And Harisori explains he would read all the commentation. He had this book, I think it either had 11 or 14 commentaries from our previous acharyas on the Bhagavatam. So Prabhupada was not just making it up. It's very authorised. So he would read all these, and also he had a book with the commentaries of his own spiritual master. So he would read all those, and then he would give his commentary on the verses. And so very authoritative. So and in the conversation during that trip, he was speaking to his servant about translating. I can't remember how the conversation was initiated, but Prabhupada basically said that to translate Sanskrit into English is very easy. It can be done very quickly. He says, and many people can do it. You know, there's many Sanskrit scholars that know Sanskrit in English. But he said to write it in a way that the common man can understand, that is very difficult. That is very difficult. And we, I mean, I only speak from us, I am a very common man, and we're able to have access not to just to Vedanta, but to actual Vedanta, and not cheating Vedanta. And not only that, the Vedanta Sutra, also I should have mentioned that Vyasadeva, who wrote the Vedanta Sutra, he also wrote a commentary on the request of his spiritual master, Srila Narayana Muni. So we don't study Vedanta directly. We commentary, which is a natural commentary by the author, which is an auto commentary. Vyasadeva has both written the verses of Vedanta Sutras and written the commentary, which is Srimad Bhagavatam. So we have this commentary, and I'm going on because Prabhupada's given us the commentaries to the commentaries to the Bhagavatam. So you've got the Vedanta Sutra, which is a summary of all the Vedas, squeezed into very, very small, precise verses, codes, you could say, uncoded and clearly explained by Srila Vyasadeva, the author, in Bhagavatam. And Srila Prabhupada's given us again his commentary, which is laced with the commentaries of other acharyas. So what a gift, you know. So we're getting the essence of the Vedanta, the essence of all the Vedas in a digestible fashion by Srila Prabhupada, that the common people can we can understand it to one degree or another and apply it in our life. And the proof that we understand Vedanta is we do bhakti, because bhakti is the essence. Even Krishna talks about yoga in the Bhagavad Gita, in the 6th chapter, he talks about all of yoga. At the end he says, Yogi Namapi Sarvasham, the true yogi, the highest yogi, he does bhakti. In the 7th chapter, Bhavanam Janmamante, the Gyanis, after many lifetimes of study and speculation, he says, they realize that that Krishna is everything, and they also do bhakti. So all knowledge comes to that point. That's Vedanta. So true Vedanta says Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is going to now speak true Vedanta, and as we'll see, it'll take us a long time because we do 2 verses a week. But you'll see they'll be quite impressed, and they admit that this Sarira, what is it called, the Sariraka Bhashya. Bhashya means commentary, and the Sariraka Bhashya was a commentary on Vedanta Sutra by Sankaracharya, who was acted as an impersonalist for a particular reason which we won't go into, and it's bewildering and misleading. So even they admit after hearing Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, actually what the commentary we were was imperfect, and we did it because that's what we had, and I also admit there was no taste in it. It must have been very dry because it's speculative and offensive. And at the very end of this lila, which is depicted and finally described in more detail in the 25th chapter, Madhya Lila, at the very end, the outcome is all the Mayavadi sannyasis, they do 2 things. They take to the chanting of Hare Krishna and the study of the Bhagavatam. So that's the outcome. So Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is able to deliver him by giving this full knowledge of Vedanta, true knowledge of Vedanta. Prabhupada mentions here, there's just an interesting point, Srila Jiva Goswami, what's he mentioned here? Anyway, mentioned as the greatest philosopher or something along those lines. Mukunda Maharaj has mentioned this to me many, many times on occasions. When he first went to England in London, there near Berry Street, in the very early days, 69, 70, 71, during that period, there was the campus for the study of Oriental and Asian Studies of the London University. And they went there for some reason, and there was a notice board. And on notice board they saw like a little advertising notice of some sort, and it said it was a course advertising course on Jiva Goswami, and it said underneath, Srila Jiva Goswami, the greatest philosopher in the world. So it's even outside the circles of Vaishnavas, Srila Jiva Goswami is extraordinary. And also in his great work, the Sandhavas, and specifically in the first part, the Tattva Sandhava, he goes to great length to establish the authority and the absolute authority of Srimad Bhagavatam, and he actually makes the points actually Shruti, because things, I don't know if I'm getting a bit too technical for some of the guests or new devotees. Anyway, it's mentioned here Shruti, Smriti, Paranchara, these. So Shruti is eternal. It's a transcendental sound that's always existed. There's no material source for it. It was a breathing of the Lord, so it exists always. It's not a particular time it was sort of spoken or created. It's eternal. It's Shruti. So the Mayavadis like to hang their hats on the Shruti. They don't accept the Smriti so much. Smriti means something you've heard about. If you've heard the Shruti, and then you write about Shruti, that's Smriti. Like the Acharyas, Mahabharata, Bhagavad Gita is considered Smriti also, like that. But Srila Jiva Goswami went to great lengths to explain the authority of Bhagavatam on the level of Shruti, eternal truth, not something that's just been made up as such, or not made up but come about as such. So the knowledge that's given to us is extraordinary, so the bottom line of Vedanta is Bhakti Vedanta, going hand in hand. The essence of all Vedanta is to engage in pure devotional service and nothing else. And Prabhupada mentions this in right here. I repeat this twice. It says here, where are we? I've lost it now. Right here. Bhakti develops in pursuance of Vedanta philosophy. So they go hand in hand. So for us to become more fixed, and Prabhupada used the term steady, factual and steady. There's another good line. When Bhakti Yoga develops on the basis of Vedanta philosophy, remember when we say Vedanta, we're not talking about Mayavad philosophy, we're talking about Bhagavatam. That's Vedanta philosophy. It is factual and steady. So real Bhakti is experience and practice and realize alongside study of transcendental literature. It's our support system, so we don't sway. And then the risk is to become sentimental, and then you have sahaja, and then it becomes a disturbance. Prabhupada says in 2 places it becomes a disturbance in society. This false understanding, cheap understanding. So it's 8:15. I can keep talking and talking, but it's a very long purport and a bit of technical information. But it's very important we understand these points, what Vedanta is, the relation to Vedanta with Bhakti, and what we are practicing ourselves is Vedanta, true Vedanta, based on the basis of Srimad Bhagavatam, and given to us in a palatable and digestible way for the common man by His Divine Grace, HG Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. We are reading the highest truth, and monkeys like me can sit here and even talk a little bit about it. And that's extraordinary. That's a miracle, really, if you digest it all. So if anyone wants to comment or ask something on Maharaj or Prabhu.
I got a question from Ajita, who's listening on the radio.
Oh, I'm in trouble now. Ajita.
Material designations such as nationalities are within the modes of nature. Transcendental indicates above the modes. Why does Srila Prabhupada say to be accepted as an acharya among Indian transcendentalists who follow the Vedic principles?
Yes, he does say that in the purport. I noted that when I read that, because really outside Indian transcendentalists there's no other transcendentalists. So I think Prabhupada is referring particularly because all the sampradayas, all sources of Vedanta are coming out of India. They're not coming out of Italy or Greece or Brazil or Peru or China. So Prabhupada's referring to be accepted in that pool of concentrated transcendentalists which are based in India, where all the knowledge is based and was actually spoken and revealed. Yes, so Prabhupada's referring to India in that context. That makes sense? Is he responding to my comment? Anybody else? There's one, two. He's writing?
But there are now.
What did you say?
But there are now.
Bhakti.
But there are now.
There are, of course, yes. And that's because of Srila Prabhupada. Before there wasn't. Before Srila Prabhupada going to the West, there was no true Vedantists in the West. There might have been Vedanta. Like I speak to a lot of my doctors about philosophy. I've got one cardiologist, and we have a little chit chat every time. He considers himself a seeker. One time he told me he'd read the Upanishads. I said, great. I said, which version? He said, the Penguin edition. And Srila Prabhupada will mention many times when he went to the West, there was over 600 editions of English Bhagavad Gita, but no Vedanta, no one doing bhakti. Tamal Krishna Maharaj once visited a professor of Sanskrit, one of the top universities in America, and he was asking about Bhagavad Gita. He asked the professor, have you read Bhagavad Gita? And the professor said, yes, I've read Bhagavad Gita. I'm a Sanskrit scholar. I've read it in Sanskrit. And he said, what are you doing? And he said, so in other words, you hadn't understand Bhagavad Gita, because if you understand Vedanta, it brings you to bhakti. It's action. Bhakti is devotional service. Prabhupada translated bhakti into devotional service, into just devotion. Because you can say, yes, I'm devotional, but you have to do something. So Prabhupada specifically gave us devotional service, means you do something. So if you understand, you've read Bhagavad Gita, you've understood it, you do service. At the end, the whole Bhagavad Gita is about bhakti. And it's interesting enough that bhakti is not mentioned so many times in the Gita, maybe 8 or 9 or 10 times directly, but Prabhupada mentioned in every purport. So, because that's the essence of Bhagavad Gita, is to give up every other process and take directly to devotional service. Krishna says that, abandon everything and just do bhakti. That is a perfection. Another comment? Sorry, I'm talking a lot now.
So, if the CC is to be the scriptures for 10,000 years, this is a relative statement.
You're saying the Caitanya Charitamrita? Why the CC? I mean, these scriptures are eternal. The Chaitanya Mahaprabhu appears once in a day Brahma, so we can assume the CC is available once in a day Brahma. Like the Bhagavatam comes also with Vyasadeva. So the Caitanya Charitamrita is actually the living Bhagavatam, because we actually see the Bhagavatas. And Prabhupada mentioned that in the purport, he refers to the Bhagavatas as the, what did he say? I repeated it twice. The person Bhagavatam, in other words, that being even more important in a sense, because from the person Bhagavatam, you get the Bhagavatam.
That statement he was talking about, the statement about Indian transcendentalists.
Yes.
The statement about Indian transcendentalists he was talking about, is that statement still going to be relative in 10,000 years?
No, because no, obviously not. No, that was it. Prabhupada, remember, was writing these books in the 70s, and he's referring to that culture at the time, which was a seat of all knowledge. It was India, was all held there, so that's why he's referring to Indian transcendentalists. But transcendentalists obviously are not Indians, they're transcendental. That's just a reference point to India, to the place, to a location. But now there's transcendentalists all over the world. As far as the Caitanya Charitamrita, how long it's going to be around, I don't know. But it's obviously, it's an eternal literature. It's very transcendental. It's considered a postgraduate study after the Bhagavatam. It's full of references in there. There's something like 800 odd Bhagavatam verses quoted in there. There's 156 just from the 10th canto. So Krishna Das Kaviraj Goswami quotes about 53 different scriptures in this book. So it's you can imagine how learned he was. And remember when Srila Krishna Das Kaviraj Goswami, they didn't have books and internet and Vinipedia and database. But he's referring to dozens and dozens of scriptures. So again, Prabhupada mentions our acharyas were very learned, very learned. Anybody, you were going to ask something?
Yeah.
I'll put you go.
Why Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was preaching and was able to transform many scholars and many others, Mayavadis, but he didn't hold, he didn't stay. And due to practice change back to Mayavadis and others. So
that's a good and interesting question. I was thinking about that myself this morning. What happened to all these Mayavadis? But there is still Vaishnavas in Benares, even though it's still predominantly. It's the nature of the age. This Sariraka Bhashya is very poisonous and still very popular. It's commentary by Sankaracharya, and it's said if you read it, you can actually lose your bhakti. You can fall. Even Prabhupada writes in one place, even a very elevated devotee can fall down from his position. So it's very toxic. So I guess the poison, he converted those devotees, but he did. But the poison of Kali Yuga and the speculation in Kali Yuga that will go on is still there, still prominent. But having said that, there's many Vaishnavas throughout India now that weren't around back then as many. So many were converted, and still many are still being converted and convinced as we speak. The Hare Krishna movement in India is huge. It's like, I think Delhi now has like something. Is it 10 temples? Yeah, it's not just like we have one temple in each. They have so many and big temples and many devotees, and they're the biggest book distributors in the world too now. India, Mayapur and Delhi, I think it is. Bombay also there. So it's still there, but it's becoming weaker, and there's certainly a wave of Vaishnava revival throughout the world and in India as well. So, anybody else? Quick, please, about a few minutes.
I'm not sure if I heard about Shruti Smriti. So is Bhagavatam Shruti?
It resembles Smriti, but according to Srila Jiva Goswami, it's Shruti. Shruti. He says it's Shruti. Yeah. Which Sorry, go ahead.
It resembles Smriti because it's in conversation.
It's a Purana.
Format.
It's a Purana. The Puranas are considered Smriti, the histories, recollections.
So all Shrutis are presented in, like, someone says something?
No. It can be. Shruti means eternal sound vibration.
So
There's no.
humans couldn't really.
They were revealed to Lord Brahma,
Okay.
and Lord Brahma, and they're also revealed to the hearts of the great sages. They're revealed. They're not something you can sort of go and pull off a shelf.
So they're not written in books.
Srila Vyasadeva did write them down. Yes, he did, because at that point Kali Yuga was beginning, and he could foresee that people were going to forget everything. So tradition, it's considered an offence to read a book in Vedic culture, to write something down, because you're supposed to memorize it. They were in previous times. You would hear once from your guru. Sutta Goswami, that we hear every morning reciting Bhagavatam, 18,000 verses. He heard it once from his spiritual master Sukadeva Goswami, and he's repeating it again sometime later. So he didn't have a book. So the books were specifically written for this age, because of the short memories. We're not able to retain. So yes, so Shruti has been written, but previously it wasn't written.
So Smriti means something written.
It means something spoken or written about, or spoken, because about Shruti. So if you, Smriti is about scriptures and books that have been, like our acharyas, they write books. Some of the devotees, our sannyasis and senior devotees in ISKCON, they write books. That's considered Smriti, because it's about Shruti. There's reference to Bhagavatam and the New Upanishads and other Shruti literatures.
And Bhagavad Gita, even though it's eternal and spoken by the Supreme Personality of Godhead, it's still Smriti.
Yeah, Prabhupada in one purport refers it as Smriti. He says like the Mahabharata, Bhagavad Gita, and that can be debated, but ultimately they go hand in hand. You can't say the purports of Prabhupada's purports and Bhagavatam are lesser than the Bhagavatam in one sense.
See, the thing is that
I'll give you a microphone.
Although it was spoken by Shruti is defined, there are Vedantas who technically categorize the different types of shastras. And Shruti is directly spoken by one in trend, by the Supreme God, and by one in trend. Then it's directly spoken, and then they categorize them. And then the Smriti, what was spoken about that. Now, within the Smritis, there are some, like Bhagavad Gita, was directly spoken by the Supreme Personality of Krishna. But technically, because it was part of the work of the Mahabharata, which is a history of everything, and it was like included in there. So technically they categorize it as Smriti. But actually, as you were saying, Jiva Goswami says even the Bhagavatam is also considered Shruti and Smriti. But, especially the impersonal Vedantas, they categorize, they're more like black and white. Okay, this is Shruti, and over here is Smriti. This was directly, and this one was about. So this is the Shruti and this is the Smriti, but you'll find our acharyas give more elaborate explanations. Wait a minute, yes, it's Smriti, but it also can be Shruti. But they don't accept no, this is about, and this is. So even though Bhagavad Gita was spoken directly by Krishna, for one thing, Vedantas don't, not all of them accept Krishna as the Supreme Personality of God. Maybe there's an ego, but it's not like considered Shruti, and because it's in the Mahabharata, it's categorized as Shruti. So the Puranas and Mahabharata, Ramayana, all the Smritis, they're spoken about, and the Shrutis are more direct. And the other thing is that the Shrutis are, especially by the Shrutis are given more importance. And very interestingly, when the Mayavad sannyasis responded to Lord Caitanya, we don't mind you being the devotee of Krishna, but what about, in other words, all right, you can be a devotee, but what's more important is the Vedanta Sutra and its commentary by Sankaracharya Sadarabhasya. Now, another good answer, now we'll hear Lord Chaitanya's response. Another good response Lord Chaitanya gave to Sarvabhaumacharya before this in Jagannath Puri, when he was a Vedantist and in follower of Sankaracharya. Lord Chaitanya didn't even say anything for 7 days. And Sarvabhaumacharya even offered to reinitiate him into a higher sanya. He didn't think that Bharati was so high. If you like, I can reinitiate him into a higher sanya. And then hear from him. So Lord Chaitanya didn't say anything. So Sarvabhaumacharya said that, well, have you heard it? What's your, commentary on this Sadarabhasya? He said, as far as Vedanta Sutra I can understand, the meaning of it's quite clear, but the Sadarabhasya clouds it. And so Sarvabhaumacharya said, oh, so give your explanation, and if you think Sankaracharya clouds. And so actually the description in Chaitanya Bhagavatam that when Sarvabhaumacharya, such a huge scholar, heard Lord Chaitanya's explanation of Vedanta and Vedanta Sutra, he was just like stunned. He was stunned, and he said, I've never heard you are like Vrihaspati, the priest of the universe. So he was totally won over by that explanation. And going back to this point, I just noted that how they responded to him. They kind of wanted to make it all one. All right, you can be a devotee of Krishna, but actually, what's the harm in reading this? And in other words, it's more important and there was another similar incident in Jagannath Puri when Srila Bhaktisiddhanta was giving a series of lectures at night in Puri, and there were a lot of scholars there and everything. And one of them came later on and said that you give very nice lectures, but you should stress more on the Vedanta and the Shrutis rather. You're telling a lot of stories from the Puranas and like that. And Srila Bhaktisiddhanta spent, I think, an hour or two convincing him why the Purana is more important. So that's another interesting conversation. But interesting that reply from, and now we'll hear Lord Caitanya have said, all right, because they all want to homogenize everything. It's all kind of one, but the real end, it's not Vedanta. When they say Vedanta is not bhakti, Vedanta is Brahman, you see. So we can present, bhakti as Vedanta, but they present Brahman as Vedanta. And so, therefore, in the purport, very interesting, Prabhupada says that one has to become, especially talking to these types of persons, you have to become an acharya, you have to become very learned, you have to study a lot, as he said, Prabhupada studied, Jiva Goswami, and that's why our acharyas spend so much time studying and presenting all this. And when you read the Sandhavas and that, you have to really concentrate. So Jiva Goswami, Prabhupada really glorified Jiva Goswami. If you really start reading some of these Sandhavas, the philosophy is so deep, and they're empowered. So to be able to talk to this level of person, who's a Sanskritist, who's a study of Vedanta, who's read the Veda, who's read, you have to be very learned yourself. And Prabhupada didn't want, at least some class of our devotees to be like that, so they can talk with these types of personalities. And I don't know, since that I went a little bit.
That's wonderful. It's interesting you make that point, because in the earlier purport, I'll finish on this point. On the earlier purport, Srila Prabhupada, in relation to Tapana Mishra and Chandrasekhar, who Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was staying with, they weren't able to defeat the Mayavadis. And Prabhupada refers to them as Kanistas, because they weren't able, which is interesting, because they're Nitya Siddhas. But in terms of not able to defeat these other Mayavadi philosophers, he referred to them as Kanistas, because they were disappointed, they were in anxiety, because they weren't able to push back.
They were very sad.
They didn't have.
And it took Chaitanya Mahaprabhu,
a very learned scholar. I mean, he's the most learned scholar.
It's very, very difficult to change the mind of these, because it's not only the philosophy itself, it's a question of a certain level of attachment. Because you invested so much of your life in that, and then to your whole life is invested in
That's the batteries running out.
Your whole life is invested in that, and then for someone to come along and then actually show you that something is higher, then it's a little bit of false ego.
You got to do it.
A little bit of false ego. Even if they agree, these ones were converted by Lord Chaitanya.
Krishna himself.
But from my experience, even they agree, they can see it, but their attachment and their ego over it is another contributing factor why they don't give it up. So generally we don't get so many coming from, if they really dedicate their lives to it, coming from there. It takes a very powerful personality to be able to convince them to move to another level. So that's the point, that's the point.
Very good. Okay, thank you kindly for your, so we've gone a little bit over time there. All glories to Sri Caitanya Caritamrita, all glories to Srila Prabhupada, Gaur Feminandi, Hari Hari. Thank you.